Welcome back to the Optimized Equine podcast. I'm your host, Tamara Barrett. My guest today is Stephanie Carter of Indigo Ancestral Health. With over 23 years of clinical experience as a veterinary technician across small and large animal practices, what sets Stephanie apart isn't her years in the clinic, it's what she did next. Rather than accepting the conventional model's approach to treating symptoms, Stephanie went back to school for human functional nutrition and has spent years applying those principles to equine health with remarkable results. Stephanie specializes in what she calls equine functional nutrition, a species-appropriate, nutrient-dense, real foods approach that treats every horse as the bio-individual they are. She works alongside traditional and osteopathic veterinarians and isn't afraid to look at the whole picture when developing a plan for a horse. Diet, environment, emotional history, training, and even the owner's energy are taken into consideration. She's also the author of Managing Muscle Mayhem, a guide to managing equine muscle disorders through functional nutrition, and her newest book, Equine Functional Nutrition, Understanding Root Cause to Restore Vitality. In today's conversation, we get into the difference between conventional and osteopathic veterinary medicine, why blood work alone doesn't tell the whole story, how chronic stress may be driving conditions like Cushing's and insulin resistance, and the difference between a horse that is truly thriving versus one that is functionally deficient. You can follow Indigo Ancestral Health on social media or visit stephaniecarterntp.com to learn more about her work. Don't forget to follow, subscribe, and rate Optimized Equine Podcast. Stay connected at tamaraleebarrett.com. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, today I am joined by Stephanie Carter of Indigo Ancestral Health. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I am really excited for people to get to know you if they haven't already. You are doing nutrition for horses, but you're doing it a little bit differently than some others may be. So can we just dive right in and have you tell us about what it is that you do and a little bit about the journey that led you there?
Sure. So, again, my name is Stephanie Carter, and I have been a veterinary technician for a little over 20 years now, I think 23. And I now do specifically what I call equine functional nutrition. And what that means is I'm focusing primarily on what I would consider a species appropriate, nutrient dense, real foods diet. And I came to that mostly through my clinical experience because I didn't start out in the more, holistic side of things, if you want to label it that way. I actually started in conventional vet med, and it was through working in small animal clinics and large animal clinics, mixed animal practices, a teaching hospital for a brief time. Really saw how much our conventional model was falling short. And we were really good at putting band-aids on symptoms and sort of suppressing them, but we never really got to the root cause of the problem. And so, the band-aids we were using would work only for so long before the symptoms would come back, a lot of times in a much worse fashion, and it would leave a lot of the conventional mindsets scratching their head because they didn't really understand what was going on, or they weren't thinking outside the box enough to work through what was going on. So I had been well down the road of being vet school bound, but I got discouraged from going just based on that experience in the clinic. So I went on to explore nutrition because through my own health struggles and my animals' health struggles, family, I really came to find that nutrition is the foundation for health. And without it, the body really struggles to manage just basic function. So I explored going to conventional agricultural based programs and was disappointed to find out that they're operating on science that's a solid 20 to 30 years behind the information we have for humans. Still following much of that same sort of conventional model that had let me down, clinically. So I opted to go back for human functional nutrition, knowing that I would take the philosophies and principles from that knowledge base and apply them to the horses. And I do dogs and cats a little bit too, but mostly the horses, where I knew we could apply them, and it gets me more significant and longer term results than a lot of the traditional agricultural based protocols.
Certainly, there's someone out there chiming in going, well, you can't just apply them and we're not the same. And that is all well and good. I find it interesting that often these are the same people that like to rely on science and research. Well, guess what? How much of that is not on actual horses either? Or
Right,
even if it was, horses that don't apply to, maybe your horse has a completely different lifestyle and
right.
background and all of that. So, what would you say to someone who's like, well, how can you apply this to horses?
So there's actually, we'll just call it an agreement basically, between the American Veterinary Medical Association and the American Medical Association called One Health. And it basically boils down to they share information back and forth because a lot of the research that's being done in the human world can be applied to the horses. Maybe not exactly, but we do pull a lot of information from human medicine because the funding is there. Unfortunately, equine specific research is underfunded. And what is being researched isn't necessarily being done independently. It's being done by a lot of the bigger, if we're speaking in nutrition terms only, the bigger feed companies in their own labs, basically. So they share AAVMA and AMA both share the information back and forth. And I think it's also important to remind everybody that at some point, millions and millions of years ago, we all evolved from the same common ancestor. And there have been studies done that have shown that in some aspects, we are a lot more similar on a genetic level than we really believe or know that we are. So it's done quite frequently, actually. And we use a lot of studies from rodents and humans across all species, mammalian species anyway. So I don't think that the argument that it's a human versus a horse is necessarily valid. I think it's more of a narrow view resting on intellectual modesty because we do it all the time. We use information across species all the time.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned a lot of different veterinary environments that you worked in. I know you work with some osteopathic veterinarians, which is how I found you. Let's say someone doesn't even know what I mean when I say an osteopathic vet. Can you tell me from your perspective, what is kind of the difference between those two worlds and how they think about solving health problems?
So osteopathic veterinary medicine or osteopaths in general really that's a really fancy way of saying the same thing that I do. As far as functional, there's functional
Right.
medicine and functional nutrition, and then there's conventional medicine and conventional nutrition. And so I think the osteopaths operate more in that functional medicine realm. And most recently, I spent, I think it was about 6 years as the case manager and on staff nutrition pro for a functional equine medicine practice. And the vet who owns that practice is an osteopath. And we worked really, really well together and still do because she looked at the horse as a whole. So osteopaths tend to look at the horse as a whole. And when we say looking at the horse as a whole, we're not just talking about the horse itself, but we're taking into consideration what it's eating, how its feet are done, what training, situations they're in, the owner's emotional status, the environment that the horse is in. We take all of that into consideration when we are developing feeding plans, treatment plans, what we should do, diagnostically, things like that. So it's really a very broad view, and protocols are always tailored to the individual horse. So there is no cookie cutter treatment plan or diet. It's all about the bio-individuality of the horse standing in front of us.
Love that. I just got done having this type of conversation with someone about feet, and I could have the same conversation about training. There's some people that want to call and hire a specialist, and they want that person to solve their problems, and everyone moves on with their life. And that just isn't, in my experience, how problems get solved thoroughly and
Right.
actually solved,
Right.
like you mentioned the band-aids earlier. I think a lot of stuff that people are calling problem solved is really a band-aid with a
Mhm.
festering thing underneath it.
Right.
We have to kind of all come to terms with, I think, what style we want to do. Do we want to have this whole horse approach? Everyone thinks it sounds good on paper, but when you actually dive in and start talking about all these different departments and all the things that are connected or not connected, it's a big challenge, and I don't think everybody is up for that. And I think that those are the people that fit so well with that conventional medicine stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, And there's nothing wrong with conventional medicine. Let me just put that out there. There's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
But
Right.
I've been put in situations where it feels lacking. And then it does start to just feel like you're getting band aids from every direction and nothing's actually doing anything.
Right.
And the other thing that I think is really interesting is when you have a big problem, people are motivated to try something alternative.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, And I'm always saying, man, if more people would come try this stuff that didn't have the train wreck, the sinking ship, you know,
Right.
like, wow, all the things that would be possible.
Well, and I happen to be the sinking ship savior. So I see more sinking ships than I do anything else at this point.
And on one hand, it's very rewarding and very necessary. But on the other hand, it's also sad how many people do not have their eyes open to these other things, whether we're talking horses, whether we're talking human health for that matter. They just don't have their eyes opened and they don't look into it until they're in like a crisis, you
Right.
know?
Well, and I don't know that the majority of folks are necessarily opposed to it. I just don't think that they know that there's another way because that's not the way the industry's operated for such a very, very, very long time. But there are a lot of other ways, and I think the only way we support the industry to continue, because I don't see it being sustainable the way it is right now. The only way I see it continuing and being sustainable is opening up the collaboration between what seems like alternative woo woo out there and conventional science. I think we have to learn to meld them together because obviously conventional medicine has its place. But like what I do and what the osteopathic vets do is we focus on prevention versus fixing a problem once it's there. So we're trying to keep the problem from happening versus slapping that band aid on only after it's happened.
So when, let's say you have someone show up with their, maybe it's not quite a sinking ship, but let's say they show up and they have a problem that they've come to you for. How often do you end up solving other problems that maybe they thought was unrelated? Does that happen often?
Almost all the time, frequently
Really?
all the time. I would say more often than not, we end up resolving a lot
Yeah.
of issues that they didn't necessarily come to me for, but they may not even know they exist. But usually, when folks come to me, I have to give them the heads up that, okay, we're coming with insulin resistance, for example, but this is just one layer of their health onion. We have to peel back the layers of the health onion because the insulin resistance isn't actually the problem. I mean, it is a problem, but it's not the problem. It's the message from the body about everything else that's going on. So, sure, we can get the insulin under control so that they're regulated, but we may have to work through all the other underlying pieces of that puzzle that got the horse to the point where they were having a metabolic challenge.
Now, do you find, kind of going back to that osteopathic vet versus the traditional vet thing, I know you work with traditional vets as well, do you find challenges there, or do you find that they're open to it just the same?
I think it depends on the vet. I think because of the crisis that we're in, vet med, when I say that, vet med in general is in because we have such a shortage of vets. I think most of them are a lot more open to discussing alternatives. And I do think that they are becoming more aware of how much nutrition plays into managing disease processes. And so they tend to be more receptive. And when I work with them anyway, because I can speak to them on that clinical level, because I've done it since, the beginning of my adult career, they respect that a lot more because everything that I say is science backed. It is evolutionarily correct as far as how the horse evolved to eat and digest and function. So when you present it to them that way, it makes sense, right? Because they don't get a whole lot of nutrition education, and what they do get is usually put on by one of the big feed companies. And so it just makes sense when you can break it down and explain it to them on a level of, this is what horses evolved to eat, here's what the science actually says. The most resistance that I seem to get are from the conventional agricultural educated nutritionists. So it's not the vets that are giving me any resistance or giving people in general resistance. It's more of the conventional mindsets within specifically equine nutrition professions.
Gotcha. That makes sense. You see a lot online of different opinions of what the diet is that you're supposed to feed, but a lot of people do talk about a diet, a specific diet to feed. So tell me how your thought process differs there. Do you have a diet, or how does that all work?
As far as I'm concerned, we need to be feeding our horses forage based all the time. There's no exception to that. Forage based. And I think the biggest problem with only following conventional wisdom, and I will use the word wisdom because it does have value, but I think where it falls short is you can't reduce a horse to population level averages and an equation on a piece of paper, because every horse out there is not the same. The NRC guidelines, which is what most of the conventional folks are all, talking about when they're talking about balancing, are based on population level. And they are established to create a baseline to prevent gross deficiency diseases. But there is a huge difference between a disease of deficiency, and true vitality. There's a big difference there. And what we balance to are ingredients to ingredients, hay to the diet, all the things that we are feeding get balanced to each other. But then the next step needs to be that they need to be balanced to the horse based on environment, lifestyle, medical history. We have so many horses that are imported from other countries to here in the States, and this is a completely different, environment for them to live in than the one they came from. Stress plays a role in all of it, a huge portion of it. And so you have to balance the diet to the horse in front of you. You can't just balance to an equation on a piece of paper. And I think that that's where conventional nutrition falls short, because we're missing that whole bio-individual part. So for me, that's kind of a long-winded lead up to, for me, we always start with forage, which is, like hay or a grass pellet of some sort, or cube, whichever's easiest. And then we round out with a healthy fat and a quality vitamin and mineral. But I also pay attention to quality and sourcing, whereas in the conventional world, they don't really focus on that. And when I say quality and sourcing, I'm considering how that feed ingredient is grown, what chemical residues may be there, how it's processed, and what residues might be left over from the processing, because all of that matters as far as reducing inflammatory burden as the horse is consuming that over long periods of time. And we have a tremendous amount of research in the human world on how all of those chemical residues affect human health. Again, I get pushback for talking about glyphosate, for example, and long-term, even low-dose consumption of glyphosate, and how that is not good for our horses, and it's contributing to a lot of the same issues that we see in humans. But I think it's important, and not looking at the human research or the rodent research specifically because it's not equine specific, I think is, again, too narrow-minded to really promote true wellness of the horse long term.
And even on the human side of things, there is information out there and we know so much more, but still, I would say a majority of the people are not spending their time worrying about it yet,
Right.
from my perspective. So how
Yes.
it's most certainly hasn't trickled all the way down to the horses yet,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
we shall see how important it all plays out to be someday, huh?
Yeah.
So you were talking about the individualness. Now, if someone is working with a different type of nutritionist, wouldn't they be getting blood work done? Wouldn't that still be individual? So what's the difference? Can you elaborate more there?
So this will be probably a little controversial because I don't just work off of blood work. And again, this is coming from over 20 years of being in a clinic. I can read some blood work like there's no tomorrow. It's great. It is the most accepted tool for, diagnosing disease processes as well as vitamin and mineral deficiencies. But where it falls short, as all diagnostic and screening tools do to some degree, is that it's only showing us what's happening on that day at that specific moment when the blood is drawn. Because the horse's body, any living being's body really, will work so hard to maintain what's called homeostasis that it pulls nutrients from wherever it needs to in order to keep the blood values where they should be, because it's very narrow as far as the range in which things can be in the blood and the horse still be vital. So non-vital functions always get depleted first. And usually that means hair, hoof, and coat, because those will take a very, very, and bone, but those will take a very, very long time to create a true life crisis. As like liver or cardiac or digestion dysfunctioning would. So it limits the view of what we can truly see. So I am not afraid to go out there and say that I work in the realm of doing things like hair tissue mineral analysis alongside blood work and also microbiome testing. And I think that that should be the gold standard, is that we're doing appropriate blood work and emphasizing the strengths of that, but we should also be utilizing the hair tissue mineral analysis and the microbiome testing in these horses that are so complex, and even early on to monitor what's happening so that, again, we can prevent disease processes from occurring. Because if the bacterial population in the gut is imbalanced, you can have all kinds of issues happening, whether it's behavioral ulcers, systemic pH can cause all kinds of things, laminitic events, allergies, you can have respiratory issues. There is such a thing as the gut-brain axis, and the bacteria in the gut, we'll talk about the horses specifically, but the bacteria in the gut are like the second brain. And if the bacteria in the gut isn't healthy and balanced, you don't have full communication throughout the body, and the horse can't digest the way they're meant to, because that bacteria is vital, and the balance of the bacteria is vital for breaking down the foods that they're eating. They can't do it without them. And then the hair tissue mineral analysis is very controversial, but I find that most people who push back against HTMA don't actually understand it and what it can and cannot do, what its strengths and weaknesses are. And they typically think that people who know how to evaluate the results of an HTMA are using it like you would blood work, that if something's in the reference range, that doesn't mean it's deficient. If something's outside the reference range, that means it's excessive. You cannot interpret HTMAs that way. HTMAs need to be looked at on a pattern basis. And based on those patterns, especially if coupled with blood work, you can see a very vast picture of what's going on systemically. And the HTMA will give us a view of what's been going on the last approximately 3 to 4 months versus that tiny little window we get from blood, because by the time the blood's off, we got big problems, right? So usually I find this especially helpful in the case of horses that are presenting as metabolic, but on blood work, they're perfectly fine. I do an HTMA and we have things like adrenal insufficiency, or they're building a calcium shell, which is the physical manifestation of a trauma response for the horses, because again, we aren't necessarily approaching them usually from a nutrition perspective of the experiences the horses have had in their lives and how that affects them emotionally. because they are sentient beings, and I don't think anyone can argue that anymore. And those experiences can cause similar physiologic responses as they do in humans. And there was a book made at least 20 or 30 years ago that came out called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's the same for the horses. So I think without all of those pieces together, you can't really determine where the true dysfunction is unless you're looking at the whole picture.
Let me make sure I have this straight in my mind. So let's say we've got a client and money is no problem. I will take all my money. I want everything
Yep.
for my horse, gold standard. Okay. So you
Yep.
said in a perfect world, you might have blood, hair, and microbiome testing. Is that poop
Yes.
testing?
That is poop.
Perfect. Perfect. Sums it right up. Okay, so with those three things, you
Mhm.
feel like you're getting the most complete picture you can get. And you're saying you can kind of see in that testing the result of some of these emotional horses with trauma issues. Is that correct? You're seeing like a physical
The
manifestation of it?
the HTMA can show us the physical manifestation of the trauma response within the horse. The microbiome is just basically telling us what the population of bacteria is and whether it's skewed towards healthy, harmful, balanced, imbalanced. And you can come up with a protocol to rebalance all of that based on the microbiome results.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, if in this scenario, would you want all of that stuff at the same time, or is it beneficial to get them in a certain order? Like, would you want blood first, blood last, anything like that matter? Just out of curiosity.
I think it depends on the case. I operate using what I call the foundations. And so blood sugar regulation for me is first and foremost the priority, because if blood sugar regulation is askew, particularly when we're talking about our insulin resistant horses, that's pretty critical, because I think it's now the research is saying that 90% of laminitis cases are caused by hyperinsulinemia. So that to me is paramount. So in that situation, I think having the blood work first is most important so that we can regulate or control the insulin. And then from there, once that's regulated, again, depending on the horse, probably oscillate between the HTMA and the microbiome test. The microbiome is going to dictate how everything we're feeding is absorbed and used in the body. So I typically opt for the microbiome first so that I know that at least what we're feeding is getting in and being used the way it should. And then from there, I'll do the HTMA. That helps break up the cost for owners too, unless I have one that's just like, no, I just want to do it all at once. But even though we do the diagnostics all at once, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do something to target the results of each test
Mm-hmm.
all at the same time. I think you have to
Gotcha.
err on the side of caution and go piece by piece. I usually collaborate with the primary care, whoever the primary
Okay.
care vet is on the case. And I usually
Okay.
give the owner a write up that says, go ahead and ask for this. This is what I would like to see,
Gotcha.
and
Okay.
anything else that they want to do on top of that.
So typically, is what you would ask for in blood work, are you usually asking for the exact same thing? Is it a basic panel, or is there special stuff that you're going to ask for that if I called my random vet out of the phone book and said, hi, I want some blood work, am I already going to have what you need, or are you wanting special blood work?
For the most part, I think at least I consider the blood work that I ask to see pretty standard. Typically, a CBC chem and a metabolic panel if we're dealing with a horse who's having an issue, potentially a metabolic issue if we don't already know. If we have a horse who comes to me who's actively insulin resistant and they've thrown the book at it and nothing's working, the titer keeps coming back the same or higher, or maybe it goes down and then goes up again in a few months, I usually ask them to test for tick diseases. I don't care where you are in the country, test for the tick diseases anyway. And actually, I've started asking for it in my international clients too, because it's there. It's there. It's all over the country here in the States, but it's moving to other countries as well. The tick disease causes can contribute to the elevated insulin. We won't go down that rabbit hole, but it can. So I do ask a lot of times for a tick panel. as well. Not just Lyme, but all of the tick diseases with my insulin resistant horses.
Gotcha. Okay. While we're on that subject, why don't I ask you a question here that relates to that somebody had submitted?
Sure.
Okay, this question says, I have a mare with Cushing's whose Cushing's number is quite high, 69 most of the time, even on Pergolide. I think the Pergolide makes her feel bad physically. There's a lot of talk about herbal options, but I'm super scared to even consider them. What is your opinion?
I don't think it's going to be as simple as they probably want to hear. So for me, I consider Cushing's to be a chronic disease, meaning it's been building for many years before it gets to the point where you have an elevated ACTH, which is what they use to diagnose Cushing's, which is the value she's talking about being 69% or Pergolide. So to sort of lead into that, for me, Cushing's is a chronic stress process. So it's usually the horses who have been systemically and potentially emotionally stressed for very long periods of time and they weren't being addressed. So we'll take, for example, a horse who's eating a heavy grain-based diet, having their hay and turnout time limited. All of those, while not necessarily overtly abusive, cause stress and inflammation within the horse or promote inflammatory burden within the horse. And through that process, if that goes on long term throughout the horse's life, which it does frequently in a lot of horses just because of the way we've been taught to feed and keep them, etc., the adrenals end up being insufficient. So when we talk about the adrenals in relation to Cushing's, normally we think of Cushing's being associated with the pituitary, but there's a whole axis called the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals. And when that axis or system of glands is functioning optimally, they talk to each other in this constant feedback loop of the hormones they're responsible for. And when any one of those glands starts to struggle, the rest have to pick up the slack. So I have a hypothesis that isn't necessarily mainstream, but there is some science that's starting to support it, again, from rodents, but we're not going to look at just equine specific, but that shows that chronic stress contributes to the atrophy or the decline of the hypothalamus, which produces the hormone dopamine, or it affects the dopamine ability for dopamine output. And dopamine suppresses ACTH. So what Presend is supposed to do is support that process, but it does make the horses feel punky. A lot of times they'll be anorexic or at least a little anorexic. They don't want to eat. They're depressed. They feel terrible. When I see horses on Pergolide whose ACTH continues to rise, the conventional reaction to that is to increase the amount of Pergolide that they're giving. The reason I don't think that that's appropriate is because if it is related to this stress response or chronic stress response, I think that the ACTH keeps going up to try to stimulate the rest of those glands in the HPA axis to do their job. And to me, that means the adrenals are insufficient because they've been stressed, and stress puts out a ton of cortisol, which is one of the hormones the adrenals are sensitive to, responsible for putting out. So if the adrenals can't do their part, the pituitary is going to put out ACTH to scream at the adrenals to do their job. So where that leads you with medication versus herbal supplementation, Pergolide is not one of those drugs that you can stop suddenly or reduce. You have to work with your vet. If you want to try to decrease the amount of Pergolide, or you want to try to get your horse off Pergolide, you should not ever do that by yourself or with anyone who's not a vet. Okay. What can be done is working with the diet to reduce that inflammatory burden and support the normal function of the HPA axis. And sometimes you can get the horses on a very low dose or potentially off of pergolide altogether. I don't have a specific herbal brand or blend that I recommend. I think it really depends on the horse and what they have going on. So it's not something I can make like a broad recommendation on. Some of them work, some of them don't, and it all depends on the individual horse. I do find that bodywork and osteopathy go a long way in helping these metabolic horses, specifically the Cushing's horses, because I have seen Dr. Hancock, who is the osteopath I was the case manager for. With the two of us working on a Cushing's case, I have seen the horse's values come back within reference range without any medical intervention at all, just by having their pull and TMJ and the rest of their soft tissue restrictions alleviated. But unless you're looking at the horse as a whole, you don't necessarily think to look at those things. Everybody just focuses on what the blood work says, but it really does sometimes take these horses more than just nutrition, more than just pharmaceutical intervention, more than just osteo to get them back to functioning optimally.
So that kind of makes me think of another question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever get to a place, or have you ever, where you have had to refer someone to a trainer or a behaviorist because you can't, they're too stressed to solve their problems? Is that a thing?
It is. And I'll go a little bit further into I have had to recommend to clients that they find themselves a therapist because their emotional projection and their level of anxiety was contributing to the horse's anxiety and things that were happening, and manifesting as a physical manifestation of a problem. But it does play a huge role. And I think that's where our conventional model kind of falls short, is you have to take into consideration every part of the horse's life. And sometimes that means different trainer, different sport, how people are training within the same sport, and trying to come from a place of empathy and being grounded. Horses respond best to empathy and being grounded. They are very responsive to our energy. I'm sure all of us that grew up, riding at least in the 80s and 90s, at some point they told us your horse senses your fear. Okay, they sense a lot more than just the fear, but it was that effect of the rider on the horse, and that's not untrue. It affects them on so many levels. And the training and the trainer and the trainer's energy and how they ask for things, and whether there's enough reward, really play a lot into the chronic stress level and willingness of the horse, because they actually do want to do what we're asking them to do. They are so incredibly noble in that way that they just want us to be happy, but they don't necessarily understand. And anybody that thinks you need a whip and spurs and all these horrible gadgets to get them to do what they want them to do really needs to take a pretty good look in the mirror because a horse can feel a fly land on its skin and twitch just that little portion of its skin to get the fly off of it. We don't need to be yanking and kicking and spurring and whipping, and they don't need that. They need clear understanding, clear direction from the people that are teaching them.
For some people, it would be easy to hear where this conversation just went with horse training and horsemanship, and they'd, of course, this is where the conversation goes because it is all connected. And other people are like, stay in your lane. But that is why
Right,
we all have to find the practitioners that align with us, because I could not agree
right.
more that all of these things matter so much. And like you're saying, I think that's so funny about saying you've had to refer the owners to get some help themselves. Definitely relate there. And I think, that's great though, really. And that's the kind of stuff that
Yeah.
changes lives versus like, well,
Mm-hmm.
okay, here, do my diet. This is what it is. Have a nice life, So I think that's awesome.
Right. Well, and that, I think, if anybody ever came to work with me, that wasn't open and willing to taking a good look at themselves, we would not get along. I am not that person, because I am not going to throw it in your face and tell you that you're wrong or you're dumb or any of those things. I will be very supportive, but you have to be able to look at yourself as well and what you're doing that's contributing to everything else that's happening, because it plays a huge role in a lot that goes on with these horses.
Yeah. I want to talk about the book you have coming out, but real quick, I'm going to ask you one more question before we go into that.
Sure.
And it is pretty
Yeah.
relevant with the weather that so many are experiencing right now. It says, with the cold snap, if we're already on a diet that you'll enjoy, do you recommend adding any additional electrolytes to increase water consumption?
I think more than electrolytes when it's cold, the warm water, keeping the water warm and free of ice open, I think is the biggest piece. If you're feeding one of my protocols, more than likely you're soaking. And a lot of people opt to soak with warm water because it helps with digestion and the pellets break down and things a lot more quickly. So I think you're already getting extra hydration into the horses, and they're eating a species appropriate diet, which should be warming and easy for them to digest and move through. So you shouldn't be dealing with, like impaction colic or anything like that from dehydration. So I don't think you necessarily need to add electrolytes.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's not to say that a horse can't struggle in the colder temperatures, but I think
Sure.
the ones that do are the ones that were already on the edge. Like a healthy horse should have no problem adjusting through this. But it's again, are we talking about thriving or just not dying? There's a big difference
Right.
between the.
Functionally deficient is what I call it.
That does sound better than mine, doesn't it? Doesn't it? That's good. Yeah. All right. So I know you had a book come out not long ago, and you have another coming out very soon. So tell us about the book that came out and about this next one that you've got coming out.
Sure. So the first book I released in September of last year, and it is called Managing Muscle Mayhem. It's a horse owner's guide to managing the majority of the muscle disorders we have out there. So if you have a horse that has, PSSM1, MIM, PSSM2, MFM, any of those, HYPP, that book is all about functional nutrition and supporting those muscle disorders as they need for their individual requirements. And the book that I am about to release, hopefully on the 17th of February, as long as this winter blast we had doesn't set everybody back, is called Equine Functional Nutrition, Understanding Root Cause to Restore Vitality. And it is the deepest of deep dives into why the species appropriate, nutrient dense, real foods diet is really the only way to support vitality of the horse in the long term.
And so you came out with your more specific book first. Why'd you choose that
Mm-hmm.
route, or was that on accident,
Well, we all get sucked into social media, right? So
for
I
better or worse?
I
Yes.
think a client came to me with her at the time 4-year-old thoroughbred that had, we'll just call it PSSM2 with the PX variant, which I know is probably speaking Greek to most people, but anyway, it's a muscle disorder. And it was really one of the first horses that I struggled with. I think because there was so much information out there, and by golly, you needed to have a PhD in genetics to understand any of it. And there wasn't really a clear guide. And so many people were talking about euthanizing their horses just because they had these muscle disorders and they were in distress and they didn't know who to listen to and they couldn't understand these classifications of these complex disorders. And I went, whoa, okay, like there are horses dying that don't need to be dying. I should need to do something. So it was not a specialty of mine. And still, I'm much, much better at it than I was, but it's ever changing. We'll just put it that way. But anyway, so I sat down and wrote a book to the best of my ability that covered the information we have now and how to manage those things. And I was fortunate enough that it caught the attention of Paul Sauter, who is the lead geneticist at Equiseek, which is the testing company here in the States that does the PSSM2 variants for the most part and a few others. And I got to collaborate with him a little bit, so I've learned even more.
So what made you dive into this second book then? Sounds like this is a little bit more of a zoomed out picture of what you do, the whole thing?
It's basically my life's work. 20 years of working in the industry and seeing all of the things that are going wrong and all of the desperate pleas of horse owners who love their horses and want them to do well and don't understand why they're not. And also to fill in the gap a little bit for the vets, because some of my closest friends in the whole world are vets, and they are so overwhelmed and spread so thin, again, because we have such a crisis in vet med, that they can't keep up with the research. They can't do everything, right? Nobody can. And so they need to be able to focus on what they're really good at doing and let other practitioners step in where we can to help support them. And I feel like this was an aspect of supporting them that I could do, and give horse owners the knowledge and the empowerment to take their horse's health a little bit more into their own hands. It was more to support both the industry that I've spent so much time in and also supporting the owners, because we have, as owners, we have to take back some of the accountability, for lack of a better word, in managing our horse's health, because vet med is headed down a very scary path right now as far as the amount of vets that we have and how few are coming out of vet school and staying in the industry, especially large animal. So we need to really start preventing these diseases. And I think the only way to do that is through the functional nutrition. So I'm hopeful it gives people at least a starting point to help turning their horse's health around.
Okay, now we have reached the most important question of the day. That is, if you were granted 3 wishes by your fairy godmother, what would they be?
Just in general? Are we talking in what? That's so broad.
I know, but that's what makes it fun. So these can be horse wishes. These can be. I find some people answer like, "Oh, I want this universal thing," and others are like, "I want a really nice indoor arena." Like, you got 3 of them, so take your pick. They can
Three,
be
a
for
whole
you.
3.
Yes, 3 wishes.
Well, okay. Well, I think my first wish would be that all of us approached the horses as a whole from a more empathetic place than we do. The second, I think, would be I think I'd love to have some passive income where I didn't have to do a whole lot of like one-on-one, really out there grinding. I think everybody wants that though. So that's my selfish wish. And the
Every horse
third would
person
be,
wants that because they're like, I just want to hang out with horses. So how do I make this happen?
or, take a nap because we have horses, right?
Yes.
It's totally non-horse related, but I'd really like to see a little less global civil unrest because it feels like the whole world is a little bit on fire right now.
Yep, I agree. I agree. That's a good one. Okay, now, so we talked about your book that's out, your book that's coming out soon. Where else can people find you, learn about you, sign up to get a consultation, all that good stuff?
I am very active on social media as much as I don't like social media. So you can find me at Indigo Ancestral Health on Facebook and Instagram. My website is stephaniecarternTP.com, and you can find video lectures, other podcast episodes I've done, a lot of blog posts, articles, things like that I've written, as well as book directly through that landing page if you want to sign up for a consult or one of my services.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Stephanie. This was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you, this conversation, and the work that you are doing.
Well, thank you for having me and letting me share the message.
My pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to click follow or subscribe, rate the show, and share with a friend. Visit tamaraleebarrett.com for more info on coaching, consulting, and links to our socials. Until next time, happy horsing.